In this video, I'm gonna walk through draining this water heater step by step as a first timer, filling it back up, and some things I learned along the way that if your situation's similar to mine, may make just replacing the heater a better option. Welcome to First Timers Homes, or welcome back if you've been here before. I'm Zach, and here's my situation. I have a 16-year-old electric water heater that I'm pretty confident hasn't been maintained much over the course of its life. So the idea is to try to drain as much sediment out of it as I can to try to extend its life a little bit, maybe help increase the capacity a little bit more, and hopefully prevent the sediment from rising above the levels of the element so that they get a little bit longer life too. But since it is 16 years old, I don't expect to get too much more life out of it. So make sure you subscribe, because when I do finally replace it, I'll cut it open and see how much is actually inside of there. And if you like the video and it's helpful, give it a thumbs up. Also, just a quick disclaimer, consider this video informational purposes only. I am not a professional, and doing this wrong can result in damage to your water heater, and you may have to either replace it or some of the components, and you're dealing with hot water. So if you're uncomfortable with that, proceed at your own risk. All right, so let's get into it. The tools I needed for this job were a couple of garden hoses, one to help with draining, one to help with backflushing. I needed a male-to-male adapter to also help with the backflushing. I needed a tool to open my drain valve. In my case, it's a flathead screwdriver. Yours may be different, check your owner's manual. And I also needed a voltage detector to help identify the right breaker to turn off my water heater properly. So the first step was to shut off the electricity. If yours is gas, you want to secure the gas to make it safe. If your breaker labels are questionable like mine, you may need the voltage detector like I did. You can use the voltage detector on the outlet and try shutting off the various breakers until you find the right one. If you have a recirculation pump, you also want to make sure that's turned off so it doesn't burn out. For gas, there are a lot of different models out there, so make sure you check your owner's manual to figure out how to make sure your burner's off and the gas line is properly secured. If you're not sure where to find an owner's manual, sometimes there's a pocket on the side of the tank that has a paper one in it. Or you can also check the sticker that's usually on the tank somewhere, and it has all the manufacturer information on there, and you can Google your model number and usually find an owner's manual that way. Making sure the electricity and the gas are turned off properly is important as the first step, because if you go to drain the water and something turns on, it can damage the component or the tank, and you may have to replace it. So with the electricity turned off, the next step was to connect a hose so I could drain the water. Mine has a brass valve on it, nice straight through ball valve, but some out there do have plastic, and if yours is one of those, just make sure the hose is on there straight and threaded properly so that you avoid damaging any of the threads from cross-threading it or over-tightening it. The next thing I did was turn off the water supply to the tank. This is the top inlet, so the valve was above the tank. So I got up there and turned that off. Some may be bottom inlets, but you should see it. It'll be pretty obvious. There's a water valve on a line going into the tank. With the water supply shut off to the water heater, the next thing I did was open hot water faucets around the home. This was to allow the water in the lines to drain out, relieve the pressure from the tank, and also allow air to flow back into the systems, so that when I started draining the tank, it would allow the water to come out a little easier. I left the hot water faucets open for the entire time draining the tank. All water heaters should also have a pressure relief valve. You could use this to try to relieve the pressure as well. I chose not to do that because with how old mine is and how much sediment I know is in there and how hard our water is, I was afraid that if I used that and opened it up, that the crust on it would prevent it from closing again, and I would never be able to get it fully shut. At this point, I had a tank full of hot water ready to be drained with the electricity turned off, the hose hooked up to the drain, and the hot water faucets around the home open. If you're comfortable at this point and you want to go ahead and drain the water as it is, go for it. It'll be hot. If you're uncomfortable and you want to try to cool the water off, there's a couple ways to do that. Leaving it turned off. You can wait a few hours or overnight. I didn't have time for that. So what I did was turn the water supply back onto the tank with the faucet still open. This let some cold water flow into the tank, pushing some of the hot water out of it, and cooled off the water temp a little bit, made it a little easier to handle. With everything set up, the next step was to open the drain valve. Mine is a ball valve, so it was a quarter turn with the flathead screwdriver. Some of the other ones out there, you may need to twist the plastic things or do some other stuff. Check your owner's manual to see how yours works. With the drain valve fully open, you should see a decent amount of water coming out of the hose. If it begins draining slowly or not at all like mine did, sediment could have settled and blocked the drain. To clear the drain, you can use a backflush. To backflush, the idea is to push water back into the tank but through the drain valve, and in doing so, pushing whatever sediment has clogged the drain out of the way. To do this, I made sure the water heater's drain valve was turned back off. And then I connected a hose to a faucet on the outside of my home and took that hose and connected it to the hose that was hooked up to the water heater's drain using a male-to-male adapter. With the hoses connected, I turned on the water faucet outside in order to push water back to the tank. And then once that faucet was turned on, I reopened the drain valve on the water heater tank in order to let the water clear the clog. I let this run for about 5 or 10 seconds at a time, cycling on and off the drain valve a few times to help try to create some pulses in hopes of breaking up the clog. And then when I was ready, I turned off the water on the faucet outside of my home, disconnected the hoses, and reopened the drain valve to let the water flow out of the tank again and see if I could get any chunks to come out. It might take a few tries. I ended up doing this about 13 times before I gave up on it, but each time I did it, more and more sediment did come out, so it seemed to help. One other thing I tried to help try to flush some more of the sediment out was with the drain valve open, turning on and off the supply line in short bursts to help try to move some of that sediment around and flush it down the drain. I repeated these steps until I got as much sediment and water out of the tank as I thought I could. Ideally, I would have got all the water out of the tank, but after about 3 hours, I still couldn't get all of the sediment and the water out, so that's kind of where I called it quits. If you have a newer tank, you probably don't have as much sediment in there. Probably really shouldn't take that long, but with an older tank like mine and having all that sediment in there, it may have been a little ambitious to think I could get it all out through that little hole. So with as much of the sediment flushed out as I think I could get at the time, the next step was to fill the tank back up. So to fill the tank back up, the first thing was to close the drain valve and make sure that it closed all the way and wasn't leaking and no sediment was blocking it, keeping it open. With the hot water faucet still open around the home, the next thing I did was turn the supply back onto the tank to start filling it back up and leaving the hot water faucets open until a consistent flow of water started coming out of them, which let me know the tank was full. This is important because if I turned the water heater back on and the tank wasn't full, it could burn out an element or cause some unsafe conditions. And if you have a gas water heater and you turn it back on without the tank being full, it can damage the tank. But with the tank and lines in the house full, I closed the faucets around the house, checked again for leaks, and once all clear, I turned the power back on to the water heater. And if you have a recirculation pump, you'd want to make sure that's turned on as well, or at this point, if yours is gas, you would turn the gas back on and make sure that it's properly relit. For gas, there are a lot of different gas control modules out there, so make sure you check your owner's manual to make sure that the pilot is still on and that the burner is properly relit. Okay, so what did I learn through this whole process? One of the big things I learned is that if your tank is super old like mine is, and it could potentially be filled halfway or more with sediment, do you think you're gonna be able to get enough out of it to really be helpful? There are some tricks I've seen mentioned to try to help get a little more sediment out, like removing the drain valve and replacing it with a bigger, better one, or pulling an element out. But in our case, I don't think I was able to drain enough of the sediment out or even get all of the water out, and we already had a pretty decent straight through ball valve on the drain, and doing either one of those things felt like a really messy accident waiting to happen that could potentially leave us without a functioning water heater, needing a replacement immediately. In my case, my wife and I spent about 3 hours back flushing, filling, draining, and repeating that process. When each time we did that, a little bit more sediment did come out, but eventually just get fully clogged again within a couple minutes. So I really don't think we were able to get enough sediment out to be helpful. And one other thing to be conscious of when you're going through this process is that you can actually cause some of that sediment to flow into the hot water lines in your house, which can end up clogging things like your sink's aerators, which happened to us.
What did we say about this?
Sink is clogged now. And made one of our sinks pretty much unusable, and so now we have to take that apart to try to get the clog out of it. So with all of that, and knowing that our tank was 16 years old and probably not well maintained, I think the better option for us would have been just to replace the tank up front and not try to drain it. But if you have a newer tank, regularly draining it will probably help prevent it from becoming as big an issue as ours has become. And our tank actually recommends draining a few gallons every month, and I think that definitely would have helped if it had been done. So if you've also ever had issues draining your water heater, let us know about your experiences in the comments below, and I hope this was helpful.